Welcome back. Before we go on to the next phase of theories that tackle the mind-body problem, I want to pause to talk a little bit more about Gilbert Ryle and his influence, and then to highlight a cross-cutting discussion that was mostly ignored until recently, but is finally getting some more attention. First, Gilbert Ryle, a British philosopher educated at Oxford University, and then a professor there for his entire career, with a hiatus to serve in World War II like many academics of his generation. Ryle is known as a follower of Ludwig Wittgenstein. For our purposes, the similarity in their views that we should keep in mind is Wittgenstein's claim that philosophy is a kind of therapy, and that the philosopher's goal is not to solve problems, but to dissolve them. A further similarity is their shared view that philosophical problems arise out of confusions about how language is used and can be dissolved by being much more careful in the use of language. The book from which we are reading is Ryle's most famous, The Concept of Mind, and we're reading the most famous and influential chapter titled Descartes' Myth. This is where Ryle introduces the idea of an error in reasoning that he calls a category mistake, and he argues that Descartes has committed this kind of mistake. It's important to understand the mistake that Ryle finds in Descartes. It's not one of dividing into two what should really be one kind of physical substance. On the contrary, Ryle's complaint is not that Descartes divides things, but that he combines them. The error, says Ryle, is to think that mind and body are two kinds of substance. He argues against thinking of mind as a kind of substance at all, but instead an activity. Descartes' mistake is to think that because minds are not extended substances, they must therefore be a different kind of substance, a thinking substance, res cogitans. So Descartes' error is not to divide mind and body, but to assimilate them into two varieties of one category, two kinds of substances. If we can avoid the mistake of thinking that minds and bodies are two kinds of substance, then Ryle thinks we can avoid the question of how mental substances are related to physical substances, and thus avoid the mind-body problem altogether. My favorite analogy for explaining Ryle's critique is the example of dancing. If two people are dancing, we might say, for example, that they're dancing a waltz. But it would be a mistake to think that when two people are dancing a waltz, three things are present: two people and a dance. That is a waltz. No, dancing is what the two people are doing. We could be confused by the sentence, "they're dancing a waltz," into thinking there must be a new kind of thing present, a waltz. So perhaps it would be better that we say the two people are waltzing. There, the adverbial phrase makes it clear that waltzing is something they're doing, not an object that they stand in some mysterious relationship to. Likewise, Ryle argues that thinking is something that people do, not a kind of thing with which they interact. Ryle was an incredibly influential thinker. He was the editor of the journal Mind in 1950 when he published Alan Turing's paper, Computing, Machinery, and Intelligence, which we'll read next week. You'll easily be able to see how Turing's views resonate with Ryle's. Ryle was also the PhD supervisor and teacher to Daniel Dennett, one of the most influential living American philosophers, and we're going to read from him in 2 weeks. And Ryle was the teacher to the African philosopher Kwasi Wiredu. Wiredu is from Ghana, which is also one of the ancestral homes of Kwame Appiah, whose textbook we're reading from. Both were trained in the English educational system, but Wiredu came about a generation before Appiah, and he attended Oxford rather than Cambridge for his graduate education. It was there at Oxford that he studied with Ryle. One of Wiredu's projects has been to analyze the ways that persons are thought of in the spiritual and philosophical traditions of Akan peoples, a significant cultural and ethnic population in West Africa, especially what's now Ghana and the surrounding countries. Wiredu argues that the Akan concept of a person is not that of Descartes' immaterial substance, so not dualistic. There are 3 parts of Wiredu's interpretation of the Akan views that are noteworthy for our purposes. First, Wiredu highlights that the Akan notion of a person involves at least 3 entities or aspects, and perhaps 5 or more. But these are not the tripartite souls from Greek philosophy: vegetative, animal, and intellectual. Instead, one roughly corresponds to the body, a second roughly corresponds to something like having moral agency or will, and the third to something like personality. This reminds me much more of the ancient Egyptian beliefs that we visited a few weeks ago, suggesting that those Egyptian ideas evolved and developed differently in Africa than they did in the Eastern Mediterranean and in Europe. Second, Wiredu shows Ryle's influence in several ways. One is the title of his paper, borrowing from the title of Ryle's famous book. Another is the denial that components of Akan personhood are entities or substances. So Wiredu denies that the Akan are dualists like Descartes. He argues that the Akan are not guilty of Descartes' category mistake, and so Akan personhood doesn't face the objections to dualism. And Wiredu also denies that there's only physical stuff in its properties, instead advancing the view that there's one kind of stuff that has both physical and psychological features. It's easy to see how Wiredu's so-called quasi-physicalism could be thought of as Ryle's view applied to the interpretation of the Akan spiritual metaphysics. But at this point I should mention that Wiredu's interpretation is not the only one and is not uncontroversial. And I'll also remind us, as Wiredu and Appiah each do, that the Akan represent just one African tradition, and it would be a mistake to take those as representing all the peoples on the continent of Africa. That said, it's fascinating to think about how Wiredu incorporates elements of both the modern Cartesian and ancient Egyptian views transmitted through Ryle's critique on the one hand and through the Akan traditions on the other hand. Later we'll get another take on Akan thinking from Appiah when we talk more about how persons can act freely.